Hi.
Well, hello, Michael. How are you
We
doing?
seem to meet each other on stages more than in around tables in normal places.
Well, we had a meeting downstairs.
That's true. That was nice.
Well, Michael, I got into this out of gratitude to Carmichael's Bookstore for being an independent bookstore, and out of gratitude for you because you've made the connection. You've articulated the connection between us and our land far better than I ever could, and in greater detail. You really followed it through, and I say that with an immense sense of relief. But I have always had trouble reading books that were assigned, even when I've assigned them myself. So when I first got this book and I knew I was into it, I would look through and I'd say, if I read 20 pages a day, how many days will it take?
It's really not the right spirit in which
No,
to approach that.
Well, what I'm trying to do is describe what a good test I am for your book. Actually, I didn't have to ration it out that way or urge myself at all because it's a very readable, interesting book. And I took a lot of pleasure and instruction from it. I'm also a good test because I don't have the least intention of learning to cook beyond the crudest kind of frying. My expertise in the kitchen runs entirely to grease.
I heard you might have an aspiration having to do with hoe cakes.
If I live long enough, I'm going to get Tanya to teach me how to make hoe cake. But as I got well into your book, it began to seem to me that it would have been a chore if all it was an informative book. That is, if it had taken a bunch of ready-made information and delivered it up. And then I realized that the opposite kind of book, and really the only worthwhile kind of book, is a book about discovery or a book of revelation with a small r. And that's very much the kind of book this is. Robert Frost said when he wanted his readers, when they read one of his poems, to have a sense of what a hell of a good time he'd had writing it. And your book very much communicates that, what a hell of a good time you were having writing it. So the book involves storytelling. It is, in a way, a storybook. And it's full of really fetching character studies or sketches, studies, sometimes there's studies. A lot of research by interviewing, traveling, reading, and then by doing things with the people who were telling you what you needed to know. And in that way, it's an adventure book. It's a participatory book. And there's a lot of humor in it.
Thank you.
A lot of puns. And I don't know whether I'm the right critic for your puns or not, but they seem to me to be wonderful.
You're a soft touch on puns.
And then I wanted to conclude this little book review by saying that I noticed the New York Times speaks of you as a food journalist. And I just wanted to say how characteristic that labeling seems to me. The knowledgeable people really feel like that if they've labeled you, that they've finished with you.
That's right.
And this would be an uncomfortable book for a lot of people. because it really goes into the hold that the industrial economy and the industrial logic has upon us and how unfree we are because of it. And so I hate to see you labeled and written off in that way, because the label obscures what a radical book this is necessarily, because it really doesn't take up any theme that it doesn't follow all the way through on. And so I admire it very much. One of the humorous parts that it's a found humor, but I give you credit for it, is Freud's theory of the origin of civilization.
Yeah. Shall we share this?
You may want to tell about it. You want to tell about that?
Yeah. Well, I was looking at, one of the questions in the book was looking at the origin of fire, the control of fire, which is so important to our species. And specifically for the reason that it allowed us to start cooking our food, which was a huge boon to evolution. It allowed our brains to get big and our guts to shrink, although now they're getting big again. But Freud had this interesting theory about the discovery of fire, which really involved, as everything did in his theory, repression. And that it was not until men could repress the urge to extinguish any fire they ran into with the stream of their urine that we could really get started. It's
well,
not subject to proof, I don't think.
There are 2 or 3 interesting possibilities there.
Yeah.
One is that Freud never went barefooted.
One.
And then he never urinated outdoors very much.
Right. At least certain times a year.
And the other possibility is that our ancestors, our primitive ancestors, peed a flat trajectory of about 35 feet. you know, there's a limit to how close you can get to a fire.
And then natural selection takes over, right?
Right. That's right. That's right. The failures get eliminated. So, well, here's a serious question. You've written about everything from gardening right on through to cooking, which pretty much completes the arc. And I just wondered if you would talk about that a little bit. And I wondered when you realized that you were involved not in one book, but in or one passage of learning, but
yeah.
in a task that was maybe endless.
Yeah. I hope it's not endless. But it's true. I mean, well, first, thanks for your book review. It's the nicest one I've gotten, and I really appreciate that. And it means an awful lot coming from you, because so much of my work is essentially an unpacking of one thing you said about that eating is an agricultural act. And I have been dining out on that for a very long time as a writer.
Well, thank you.
And
I spent weeks on it.
Well, I've spent years on it now. But the reason that this book is dedicated to you is because it's very much informed by your way of approaching, of connecting the dots between very ordinary things, you know, the plate in front of us, and all the larger systems, both natural and economic, that organize our lives. And that's been my project for a long time, connecting the dots, showing people how their food connects them to the earth, to other species, to other people. I thought when I finished Second Nature, which is my first book, as you know, and Wendell really was although we hadn't met then, he was the kind of Virgil that got me out of the woods there, because I was in deep with, I had Thoreau telling me I couldn't do anything to the woodchuck, and the weeds that was molesting my garden. And Wendell, in his work, convinced me that, in fact, I did have a legitimate quarrel with nature. I think that's your phrase. And I thought I had kind of explored what I had to say about nature by the time I finished that book. And then I went off to write a book on what I thought was a completely different subject, architecture. And I wrote a book, little known, called A Place of My Own. And sometime in the middle of writing that book, I mean, second books are very interesting things, because that's kind of where you figure out what are your abiding concerns. And I didn't realize what mine were at that point. And I get into this book thinking, I've left nature, I'm in the realm of culture, I'm writing about architecture and history and building and carpentry. And I found I just kept, there was still this tropism taking me to what was interesting to me in architecture was the nature piece. Did nature have any wisdom for us on how to build? And I realized at that point, and I fought it for a long time. It was a very hard book to write for that reason. And then I finally realized, well, I guess that's really my subject. I'm very interested in nature in the places where the human world and the natural world engage and have to change one another. They can't merely admire one another. And so then I kind of accepted it and have been happier since. But and every book has kind of been a little bit of a sourdough starter for the next. I can often find toward the end of a book the kernel of the next one. So in the end of Botany of Desire, I found myself on large industrial farms in the West, such as I had never seen. I came from the Northeast, where farms are still kind of, you know, picket fencey and cute. And these were 35,000-acre potato farms, remote controlled from a bunker with this sweep secondhand, covering 150 acres, spraying pesticide and fertilizer and water, and realized then that there was a story that my urban readers certainly needed to hear about where their food was coming from, and so on. And so one book has kind of engendered the next, although it sometimes takes me a while to figure that out. But I do sort of feel like I have completed the arc on the food chain, at least in this country. And that this book was the missing piece for me. Because I'd written about the earth end and agriculture and Omnivore's Dilemma, and then the body end in Defense of Food. And the middle link, these transformations, I realized were really important, because how we eat, who's cooking for us, determines what kind of agriculture we're going to have, and it also has a tremendous bearing on how healthy we are.
So it is endless, Michael. You say in your book that cooking is a link that connects culture and nature. Farming, of course, is another one of those links, and forestry is. And so there's a conversation going on there that probably really is.
That is endless.
Endless.
Sure.
It can't be stopped.
This is the human condition.
Because we change and nature changes.
Right.
We're talking downstairs about how the issue with cooking is not really a feminist issue, but is an issue about the depreciation of an art. And there are a number of things in your book that remind me how essential this connection of culture and nature is, and therefore how essential cooking is. And what you're really talking against is the idea that cooking is optional. And that made me think of a question. I wrote it out. What will be the effect on farming, gardening, cooking, and eating of the end of cheap energy? Are physical work and real cooking going to remain optional? I don't know whether that's crossed your mind or not, but it crossed mine at a certain point in reading, and pretty early in your book.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the reasons to cook is to be ready for that time. I don't mean in the literal sense that you won't be able to find processed food and McDonald's won't be able to, you know, fill your belly anymore. They may or may not be able to. But I mean in terms of weaning yourself from a certain kind of dependence. I think one of the things that stands in the way of our dealing with the environmental crisis, and the big implication of which, of course, is that our life is going to have to change in various ways. We can't go on living the way we're living and using energy the way we're using it. But we can't imagine another way of living because we're so dependent on what you've called the cheap energy mind and the fact of cheap energy. And the idea that we might have to do more for ourselves is scary when you can do so little for yourself. So that even as exercise, cooking now and then, gardening, growing a little bit of your own food, all these domestic arts they exercise a muscle that's atrophied to the point of non-existence in many people that I think is very salutary for dealing with change of any kind. And change is coming. I think it makes you more flexible. It makes you more confident, optimistic, because you feel more self-reliant. And self-reliance is going to be a very important virtue when energy runs out, if it does run out.
One of your informants, Harry Balzer?
Harry Balzer, yeah.
You raised the question, can we ever go back? He says it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
You went right on writing your book.
Yeah, this is a food marketing consultant in Chicago. This is a man who works for the food industry, helps them analyze consumers so they can better sell food. But he's a very candid man. And he has the cynicism of someone who's been doing market research for a very long time. They don't see the more noble sides of our, they're seeing us as pure consumers, right? I mean, which is not our most ennobling role. And Harry Balzer, I spent a lot of time with for this book. And when I talked about a revival of cooking, he's like, never going to happen. We're too cheap and we're too lazy. And he's got the statistics to prove it, basically. and you know, cooking has been declining since the mid-'60s. It's fallen by half. We're spending about 27 minutes a day cooking and 4 minutes a day cleaning up. And that latter statistic should alert you to the fact that that kind of cooking may not be the kind of cooking your grandmother did. I don't know about you, but in 4 minutes I could crumple a pizza box and maybe scrape a few plates, but I think that's it. So even the definition of cooking has gotten very loose. But he also said something very telling to me. We were talking about the obesity crisis, and he was talking about, he's completely acknowledges, unlike a lot of people in the industry, that processed food is at the heart of that, and not cooking is at the heart of that. And that the fact that industrial cooks, i.e. food processors, make the kinds of food you would never make at home. I mean, who's going to make a Twinkie, or it's just too, defeats us. But they can make it very efficiently. And I said, what are we going to do about this? And he said, you want to know the diet for America that'll work, the one diet that will work? And I take out my pad and eager to write, yeah, what is this? This is the voice of deep in the belly of the beast, big food. And he said, eat anything you want as long as you cook it yourself. And there's a lot of wisdom in that, because you won't cook that kind of crap. You won't make French fries more than once a month because it's too messy and too much trouble. But if you let corporations cook for you, you'll have them twice a day, and many of us do. So he is a kind of voice of wisdom, even though he's an ultimate cynic. But he's a realist. But I was asked earlier today, do I have any hope that we can turn this back and revive home cooking? And so you go looking for models of a norm, a cultural norm that went down one path and it looked inevitable, and then somehow we turned around. And the example that occurs to me is formula feeding babies. Back in the 50s, I was formula-fed baby because that was, my mother regarded herself as a progressive person, and that was the progressive thing to do. And a great deal of marketing had gone into convincing American women to begin the processed food diet basically right at birth. And this seemed inexorable, but it wasn't. People recognized that this was a mistake, that it had implications for the health of the babies, and that was turned around by some good storytelling and some good science. And I think something similar could happen here.
Wouldn't you think that lazy people would be breastfeeders?
It's a good point.
It's a lot of trouble to wash bottles.
Yeah, it is.
It's
more than 4 minutes a day.
Yeah, you got all the equipment right there, and it's free.
Well, which makes you think, what an amazing marketing job that was, right? Pay
Right.
for something that was free, complicate something that was simple, but not for everybody, but simple for a lot of people.
So you have to deal. You confront it in various ways over and over, I think. That right now we have the privilege of looking upon something like gardening or cooking as a hobby. Mm-hmm. We can choose. If we have the money,
right,
we can choose to do it as a nice pastime. But as these changes come, they may not come just because people choose. There may be an element of force in the circumstances, more costly fuel and so on, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that that's very possible. I think that I can easily imagine a time when growing food becomes imperative. And so we practice with our hobbies. And I think that's what hobbies are. They're rehearsing something from the past or the future. I mean, it's very curious that we like to grow food and go camping and ride horses, you know, all these kind of activities that were once central to everyday life. We're drawn to them. And some of it is a kind of maybe a racial memory or some kind of the stories we've heard about it. But they may have a value in the future as well.
One of the things you talk really well about, I think, is bread.
I love bread.
You obviously like it. And a number of wonderful things you say about it. We can't survive on flour, but we can survive on bread.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
Yes, I'm still amazed.
And that was a
really, really pleased by that. That's
Yeah.
very pleasing knowledge.
Well, let me explain why that's so. And that was a scientist, a food chemist who told me that. And it makes you appreciate that baking bread is a very powerful technology. And we don't think of something like baking as technology, but it is. And so flour is just basically, you know, milled, crushed grass seeds. And like all seeds, they're full of everything you need to create a new life. They're amazing things. You've got all the minerals you need, you've got the proteins you need, you have the energy source. They're all there, but they're locked up really tight, and they're being defended against any kind of pests and saved for the new life, for the germinating plant. So you can make a porridge out of grass seed, and it'll have some nutritional value, but a lot of it won't be broken down and therefore can't be absorbed. But when you bake, when you make bread, first with the sourdough fermentation, you have this community of bacteria and yeasts that put out all these enzymes, and they're in the business of digesting these things, and they know how to break them down. That's what they're doing in nature. So they begin this process of releasing the minerals and cracking open the proteins. And then you bake it, and you can get the interior of a bread much hotter than you can porridge boiling in a pot, where you can't get past the boiling point, basically. But what happens inside of bread is that the crust of it makes it a pressure cooker. And steam builds up in every one of those little holes, the alveoles. And so it gets very, very hot. I don't know, 300, 400, 500 degrees in there. And this cooks the starch properly and opens it up and makes it very accessible to us. So bread, I know it's maligned right now, and gluten is the bogeyman of the American diet at the moment. But if you can step back from that a little, and there are people who struggle with gluten, it's a marvelous technology. And we've screwed it up a good deal, but there it is.
One of the good things about your book is that it keeps coming up with lovely things like this. You say that when you finally, after much effort, much learning, finally achieved a really lovely loaf of bread, you say you felt an upwelling of pride that took me by surprise.
Yeah.
I love that.
It is, I mean, there's something about bread that, you can make a stew, but it's not much to look at, right? But a loaf of bread, if it gets nice and big, this is a male ego thing, perhaps, and there it is, and it does feel pretty good. You took that places I didn't mean for you to go.
Well, that's revelation, you see.
That is revelation. It is revelation, and it's the power of transformation. And I think all my work has been about transformation, actually, looking back. And I'm constantly amazed at our ability and nature's ability to turn one thing into another. And that's, I just keep coming back to that narrative.
Now, I want to make 3 references to your book. I want you to talk now about white flour.
Good.
And you speak of the engineering that's involved in white flour, the industrial logic. And you use the testimony of a dear man named Steve Jones out in Washington.
You know Steve Jones,
yes, I do.
Sure, right?
I recommend him.
Yeah, I do too.
And
He's
then,
a wheat breeder who's doing some really good work.
I think he said that the engineering and nutrition are going in opposite directions.
Yeah. And
Collision.
Yeah, he was very blunt. We're selecting against health in the way we're breeding wheat. Isn't that amazing?
And then you say, if I want a good loaf of bread, I need a whole different civilization.
Yeah.
Now, there's something you can talk about a while.
That's an open-ended question. Well, the bread chapter is air, right? The book is divided into the 4 elements. And for air, since bread is 80% air, I explored, the subtext of that chapter is the history of food processing. And one of the questions, one of the mysteries in my mind when I started this book is that we have this long history of developing technologies to cook our food that one after another made them more nutritious, more tasty, more health-giving in every way. And beginning with fire, which made meat much more easy to digest and nutritious, and then cooking in pots, which did amazing things because it allowed us to soften seeds and combine flavors and feed people even after they no longer had teeth, and wean babies on. And it extended the lifespan when we could cook in pots. That's about 10,000 years ago. And then the invention of bread, as I said, and the invention of cheese or discovery of cheese. All these things are net gains for human health and well-being. But then something happens. When we talk about processed food, we're talking about stuff that's bad for you. So when did we turn the corner? I think it really comes at the moment we learn how to make really white flour. And this is in the 1880s with the invention of the roller mill. Before that, you ground flour seeds on a stone mill, and you could not separate the different parts, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. People have always wanted whiter flour, and they would bolt or sift to get it. And there were reasons for that. It was easier to digest, people thought, whole grain, when you had kind of crude milling, led to the erosion of teeth. And it was just more prestigious, as it is in Asian civilizations, white rice. But we got so good at it with the roller mill that we completely removed what was healthy in grain, the germ and the bran. And we took the healthiest part and sold it to the feedlots or the pharmaceutical industry, who could then sell us back the vitamins that were missing from the flour, because we had all these nutritional deficits, deficiencies, as soon as we did this. And we had outbreaks of public health problems. This is when type 2 diabetes really begins. And this is when so many heart disease, so many things begin at this era when we learn how to refine flour and refine sugar. And it happens around the same time in England. So that was, that I think is where we got almost too smart for our own good in whitening flour. And we fixed the problem, as capitalism always does, not by going back and dealing with the systemic issue here, which is, oh, we should put some of that bran and germ back in. That would have been easy. No, we put a Band-Aid on it with, we began fortifying flour. Wonder Bread was the product of something called the Quiet Miracle that the government worked out with the bakers to put some vitamins back in and fix the problem that had been created without actually, they didn't want to go back to whole grain because, well, we liked white bread, but also it didn't fit into the industrial system. Because once you had white flour, you didn't need a mill in every town. Because when you have the germ in flour, you have to eat it fresh, and it goes bad. It gets rancid. So it was a fresh product. And white flour was shelf-stable. You could keep it around for years. And it meant that the milling industry could consolidate, and one mill could service, 100 square miles, 200 square miles. And so we have a system built around this white flour, and they don't want to go back. And in fact, according to millers I interviewed, when you buy commercial whole grain flour, it doesn't really have the germ in it, even though it's supposed to, because the germ is just too troublesome in an industrial economy. So there are people, still doing stone milling, and if you bake and you want to use whole grain, you really need to use stone milling. Although millers there's a history of millers not being trustworthy. Going back to the French Revolution, they would put anything in flour. They'd put bone meal and chalk and alum and all sorts of stuff because you couldn't tell what it is. And millers still aren't trustworthy from everything I was able to learn.
Grinding.
What?
Grinding. If you ground meat, you grind meat.
Well,
you didn't put anything in it.
Horse meat, pink slime, that's right. We're seeing the same thing. Whenever you have a food that's undifferentiated, you're at the mercy of whoever's doing it. And so that's right. It's the same deal. So anyway, we needed, I went looking. My quest was to bake a really good loaf of whole grain bread, which is harder to do. But everything I'd learned about the health made me realize this is what we have to figure out how to do. And, we've all had bad experiences with whole grain bread. There were all those, virtuous bricks produced in the 60s and 70s. And, they have their place. But we have to do better. And there is a renaissance of really good whole grain baking. But you can't just go to General Mills and get their whole grain, because it's part of a system. And they're still separating the germ and the bran and the endosperm, the white part, and then they recombine them, probably, mostly, maybe. But in fact, the act of separating them ruins the flour. You have to keep it together the whole time for it really to be healthy and for it to be stable. So you'd have to just kind of, as I said, you need a different kind of economy and a different kind of civilization to do this. And we're building it, though. People like Steve Jones are starting. There is a local grain economy that's rising in the Northwest, in Northern California. I know people involved there who are now growing wheat. People don't realize, it was a very important California crop before the irrigation projects came in, because you could grow it without irrigation, winter wheat. And that are learning the techniques of milling properly. And the baker that I profiled, Chad Robertson, is now making the most beautiful whole grain breads. So, but you need the whole economy to change.
Is he the one of whom you said he's interested in the whole grain, not just the parts?
Yes, yeah.
The parts put together.
And it's reductive thinking, right? I mean, it's the idea that you could take the parts apart, put them together as you wish, mix and match. But in fact, the seed has an integrity. And if you keep it together, there are antioxidants in the bran layer that protect the germ from going bad as quickly. So there's a logic to nature, and there's a logic to industry.
So it's like breastfeeding. I mean, if you're interested in whole grain bread, and that means putting the parts back together, in order to make a business of that, you've got to forget that they were all together to start with.
Exactly. I see what you're saying. It's exactly the same thing. And
so you make somewhere in there you speak of a good business plan that doesn't make much sense. That's one of them.
Yeah.
You take it all apart, you get paid for that, then you put it all back together again, you get paid for
again.
that.
That's right.
But if you started with the thing when it was already together,
right.
That's for lazy people again.
It makes biological sense, but it doesn't make industrial sense. And that logic we keep seeing bumping up against one another. But yeah, it's kind of that reductive thinking. Take things apart, put them together. And what was formula, but of course an effort to simulate milk and assumed a certain kind of arrogance. And actually there's an interesting story about that in the book. One of the mysteries of milk, if we can talk about milk again, is that it's full of a nutrient that babies can't digest, oligosaccharides. It's a kind of sugar, complex sugar. And it's bedeviled nutritionists for many years. Why would natural selection put in breast milk, which should be the perfect food for babies because it's selected for, and anything that didn't have a purpose, natural selection should have dismissed at some point because it's not a good use of the mother's resources. So what are all these oligosaccharides doing there? And it turns out they're there not to feed the baby, but to feed the microbes in the baby's large intestine, the microbiota, microflora. And that's a big wake-up call about food, I think. And as one of the scientists I talked to said, mother's milk is the Rosetta Stone for all food. We need to understand that if we're going to be able to make food healthier than it is. And what that means is, I don't know if you realize that, I don't think I said it in the book, but you're only 10% human, right? You're 90% microbes. And baby formula and industrial food in general doesn't feed the 90%. It only feeds the 10%.
This is ecology.
This is ecology, yes. It's not theology, it's ecology.
You say, that takes us back to nature again, and you say a very interesting thing.
You can't get away from nature.
No, you can't. Let's don't try. You say about your sourdough starter, control you can just forget about.
Yeah.
That's the nature part. And that seems to me to be really important. White flour comes from our idea that we can, of absolute control. The whole industrial logic is absolute control. And this ability to work with something that you can't control calls for a peculiar kind of grace, gracefulness that's probably going to turn out to be necessary.
And is increasingly uncommon. I mean, many people are frustrated by that. And that's what commended fermentation to me the part of the book where I think I got most excited, the earth section. Going back to your point about this dialogue with nature, I've been involved in that, for all my writing life, and you've been involved with it as both a writer and a farmer. And suddenly I was involved in it at this other scale, which is the dialogue with the unseen species, the bacteria and the fungi, the yeasts. And it's the same story. It's just a little more mysterious because you can't see them. But you can't control them. You can, at best, give them what they need to thrive, recognize when they're happy or unhappy, and kind of guide them. And in that, it's a lot like gardening or farming.
Now, clearly, in anything that's mysterious that you're fooling with, there can be bad surprises. But there are also rewards, right?
Yeah.
It tastes a little different.
That's right. You get away from homogenization. One of the things that's amazing when you make fermented food, and I learned how to make kimchi and sauerkraut and cheese and beer, is that the microbes in Kentucky are different than the microbes in California. And so you get this microbial terroir. I mean, you have these qualities that are imparted to food. This is why we have, hundreds of different cheeses. Because
the taste of a particular place.
The taste of
you
place.
wrote.
Yes.
That's a terroir.
That's terroir. And we always thought it had to do with soil. Winemakers have talked about terroir for a long time, and cheesemakers, and we think it has to do with the local grasses, and it does. But there's this other element that we've only recently become aware of, which is that the microbes are somewhat different in different places, and they give very different flavors to fermented food.
And it can be from farm to farm, as the winemakers have
real microclimates can lead to complete changes in flavor. So it's an argument for, making your own in a way, because it's gonna carry the signature of you and the signature of your place. And my kimchi is going to be nothing like yours. Nothing like yours.
Nothing like nothing. Well, you said a while ago, you used the phrase, too smart for our own good. And that's a phrase I'm inclined to take seriously as a possibility that we can be and have been. And maybe we can, I hadn't thought of it before, but maybe we can put the next topic I wanted to talk about under that heading, and that is the way we've allowed sanitation to be used as a kind of weapon in marketing food and other things.
Yeah. Well, we've been in a war against bacteria now for a very long time. I mean, since Pasteur told us, we learned that these certain bacteria make us sick. And that's true. And antibiotics have been a great boon to humankind. But the number of bacteria that are a problem are really small compared to the ones that are either beneficial or just kind of freeloaders. I grew up in a household where bacteria was the enemy. And my mother, if she dropped a can on the floor and it got a dent, she was convinced it had botulism in it. And it has to bulge if it's going to have botulism in it. And we were, we didn't eat pork, not because she kept kosher, but because of trichinosis. And so there were all these microbes lurking. And one of the real exciting things about discovering this subculture of these fermentos, I call them, these people who are just so obsessed with fermentation, is that they're pacifists in this war on bacteria, and they're trying to completely change how we feel about bacteria. And sanitation it's an obsession of the government. It's an obsession of the food industry for reasons that are not completely concocted. I mean, there are real food safety problems, but the solutions to those problems are sometimes designed in such ways that they're crushing to small farmers and artisanal food producers. And in any market, the biggest players benefit most from regulation, because whatever the regime is, or the technique or technology you're requiring people to use, they can amortize it over thousands more units. And the small producer can't do that. And Joel Salatin has talked, a friend of both of ours, has talked about this a lot. And he's argued for kind of a performance-based solution. Just take swabs of my chickens and tell me what level I have to hit, and I'll hit it. Let me figure out how to do it. But food safety is a complicated issue because people want to drink raw milk, and raw milk is a great food, but it does have a risk to it for certain people. And it seems to me people should have the right to drink any milk they want. but it gets a little more complicated when you think about giving it to children. And people will say that, oh, this milk is my grandfather's milk. That my grandfather, drank raw milk, so I should be able to do it. And Sister Noella, the cheesemaker who I work with, who's also a microbiologist and a nun, and a wonderful cheesemaker, she points out, even though she uses raw milk and is a great supporter of it, she says, well, it may be your grandfather's milk, but you don't have your grandfather's immune system. We've changed too. Mm-hmm. And we've changed in ways that make us probably more vulnerable to bad bacteria. In many ways. I mean, because we have less experience of bacteria, we have an immune system less able to deal with bacteria. And because we're eating this fast food diet and taking all these antibiotics, our internal ecological community is disordered. It's not healthy in many, many people. And when it's not healthy, when you do eat, when you ingest pathogens, they're more likely to get out because the epithelial wall, that second skin in your body, is not healthy, and so it's permeable and letting things out. So it's it's a messy area, and I don't have any answers to it. I think that we need to create a space where small food producers can thrive, and we have to figure out a way to protect people. But there's a reason that some people get really sick when there's an outbreak, when there's E. coli in meat or salmonella, and then many people don't. And the difference may have to do with the health of their gut.
Well, maybe we could begin our work on that by noticing that we can bring the whole force of government into play against the possibility of the presence of a germ.
Yeah.
But it's just virtually impossible to get them worried about pesticide and herbicide residues, heavy metals.
Yeah.
Those things that really are sometimes lethal.
That's right. And those all have economic interests supporting them. People make money from all those things.
We're back to the industrial logic.
Oh, here we go again. But it's true. There's nobody making money producing the bacteria in quite the same way. They don't have a lobby. But they will soon. I mean, the fermentos will defend them.
Now, Michael, I have to ask you a question. Is somebody going to tell us when this is over?
Well, the idea is...
Yeah.
Let me tell you how this works. Actually, we're supposed to go to questions.
I know we are.
Yeah. So why don't we just do it?
But as far as I'm concerned, I'm willing to quit talking to you and let you talk to these
Let's talk to them.
I think we started about 50 minutes ago.
I know. I wasn't looking at the watch. But we do have some time to take your questions, and there are 2 microphones set up, one there, one there. So if you do have a question for either of us, please come forward. Sorry, it was a little abrupt. It wasn't shapely, that ending.
Well, I wanted to, maybe you could end after it's all over by telling us a story.
Okay.
I'd like to hear the story of Kosher?
Kosher
the pig.
Okay. All right, good. We'll save that. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. You talked earlier, when you're talking about your work, you described it as an art. And you said that with this book, you sort of connected the 2 ends of the art. It seems to me, it strikes me that's a very linear picture of the world. And the world is much more cyclical. Is there perhaps yet another book that will sort of bring us back around and connect the ends of that arc you were talking about and create a full circle?
I was all set to stop. There'll be other books, but I don't know. They won't be part of that story, and I don't know what they will be. But there will be other books. I just thought, in terms of telling this story about our food chain, the one we're in, that we have the power to change this connected the three big points on it for me. And maybe I'll find another. But if I write about food again, I think I will try to do it in more of an international context. I really feel this question that people who care about sustainable food get harassed with about feeding the world needs an answer. And so that's one thing I'm interested in writing about. But you know, there'll be other books. I don't know if they'll complete the circle. I don't think it'll be that orderly, frankly. But thank you. I think your microphone's not on. There we go.
That's better. I'm a physician and a pediatric weight management specialist, and so I'm curious about because you talk about we need a different culture, a different society for things to actually change. And I was wondering, have you found some tools or some ways you think we can engage those who have money and power, i.e. industry and the food folks, to bring them along? Because, I mean, I think it's a subtext of what you said, but we can't just implode the entire system.
No.
We've got to move
right.
into a new place. And you've implied that as well, that we are not the same person as our grandparents. And so we're not going to end up back there. We're going to end up somewhere else
right.
that perhaps we haven't fathomed.
Yeah. Well, that point about a whole new civilization, that's very discouraging to people, you know. That was just about good flour. That wasn't about everything. Maybe Wendell disagrees with me about that. But in terms of the issues that you're talking about, obesity and the public health crisis related to food, you know, there's some good news. The statistics look a little better than they have in a while, and maybe we've kind of hit bottom or top on the obesity epidemic. Or maybe just in a bad economy, there's not enough food around. It's going to take a couple more years to find out. I think change will come. And this is a somewhat cynical political analysis. I just think you need powerful interests on your side in this society to make change happen. So who are the powerful interests that would change the way we market food to kids, the way we feed our kids, and the way we approach the health of our kids? And I do think that depending on how the healthcare law develops, I have seen signs in places where the health insurers or the government are really on the hook for the costs of people's health care and profit from improving it. Kaiser is a great example. It's a hospital chain in California. It's not just California, and they have a different model. They basically take a certain amount of money and they make more money for you. They don't. It's not fee for service. They basically are paid to keep you healthy. And the more they can lower type 2 diabetes, the more profit they make. And lo and behold, they've taken a powerful interest in food. They have farmers markets in their parking lots. They teach their doctors how to cook in the hopes that they will pass that on to their patients. They have very good food in their hospitals. And they agitate about agricultural policy. So everyone kind of recognized that's the model we need to move to, and I don't know how long it'll take to get there, but I find when I talk to people at health insurers that they get it, and that a lot of them realize that the big exploding cost is type 2 diabetes, and that's not that hard to reduce, you know, as Mayor Bloomberg is trying to do. By lowering soda consumption, for example. That's one sort of simple thing you can do that will lower rates of type 2. It's a completely preventable, almost completely preventable disorder. So, and that's a reason that Mayor Bloomberg is working on these issues. When he became mayor, he was looking at the budget and saw there's a very big public hospital system in New York, and it was bankrupting the system. And somebody told him, I'm told, that every case of type 2 diabetes, every new case diagnosed, costs the system $425,000 over the life of that kid. And he thought, well, the way to get a handle on this budget is to reduce type 2 diabetes. And he's been trying, against terrific headwinds, we know, to reduce soda consumption. So it's that constellation of forces that I think will create the political will to try taxing soda. I don't know if that's going to work, but I think we certainly need to try it, to try what he's doing with the portion controls, to try public service campaigns about soda consumption, to get soda out of vending machines and, in our schools and other places, and all the other things that we need to do, to align also our agricultural policies with our health goals. And right now they're going at cross purposes because we subsidize things like high fructose corn syrup, which makes no sense. This is like, as Tom Friedman always says, we're supporting both sides in the war on terror. Well, we're supporting both sides in the war on type 2 diabetes. So that's what that's my hopeful scenario, hopeful, cynical scenario.
Thank you.
There you go.
Hello,
It's on.
I guess this is kind of a tag-along philosophically to her question. You spoke earlier about the issues with our society and how there's this focus on this hyper-antiseptic, hyper-clean, sterile environment, which I guess is kind of a two-part question. Do you think that has created a self-fulfilling prophecy and this kind of chain of events that it's like the more pesticides and the more funky ingredients we're using in our foods or to treat our plants as they're growing or feed our animals, what would have to happen in order to break that cycle, do you reckon? And if so, is it would you say, a mutual kind of taking a step back as opposed to one factor of that having to eliminate, whereas saying, okay, well, maybe we don't have to have everything so clean, or maybe we should stop using some of the agents that we are using currently?
Well, I think that I think what is coming here, I'm being asked for a lot of prophecy here. I should be more modest. But I think that we will fairly soon begin to recognize that we are a superorganism. And that in the same way we learned that there were these ecological communities it was very important to defend and protect, forests, the sea, we're going to learn the same is true for the microbiome, which is to say the species that live in you and on you. And because we're going to find that we can treat a lot of diseases by gardening that microbiome, by cultivating it. And that I think that will lead to a change in attitudes toward bacteria. I've been interviewing scientists that I began in the book. There's a section on the microbiome, and my discussion of fermentation led me to the fermentation within. And they have interesting kind of echoes. But I've been interviewing scientists since, and I asked them, given what they've learned about this, and it's a very exciting area of science. I mean, they're learning that the microbiome may explain chronic disease. It just may account for certain neurological problems. But these bugs inside us, they're manufacturing all sorts of chemicals that affect us for good and ill. And so I asked these scientists, these microbiologists, so what do you recommend? How should people eat? How should they live? And they won't say. They say it's too soon, it's too soon. And finally I got tired of asking them, so I said, well, what do you do differently now that you know all this? I mean, that's just a journalist trick for people who don't want to pronounce. And they all said, well, we've definitely loosened up on the sanitary regime at home, encouraged the kids to play out in the dirt, play in the garden. Got a pet, interesting, more exposure to bacteria. We don't eat processed foods because the additives in processed foods they've never been tested for what they're doing to the bacteria. And they're doing some bad things to the bacteria. And what else? Oh yeah, we try to avoid giving our kids antibiotics as long as we can. Because every course of antibiotics reduces your biodiversity within. And so, You know, I think that there's a real shift coming, and that our attitude toward bacteria will, in the next 10 or 20 years, I think, will be really different if we can tell the story properly of what's going on and actually offer people some benefit from this new way of thinking. I'm way too optimistic.
Well, try to be a little more pessimistic.
Let's see what we can do for this gentleman.
You got one more chance.
Okay.
Thank you all. I was thinking about the Industrial Revolution and the movement from the family, from the rural setting to the city to work in production. And I know at the beginning there was some awful stuff that happened with child labor and stuff like that. But for the most part, the father left the family, left his land. They moved to the city so that they could work in production. And then the man's productivity in a factory somewhere outside of an agricultural setting became his livelihood. And then we progress, several decades, and we come to see women working as well, leaving the family as well to work and be productive. Interestingly, not long after the Industrial Revolution, we find that we can refine wheat and make food products. And interestingly, not long after women start working, we find that we have breast milk that's fake in little cartons. And I was wondering what you would have to say to that, people's schedules, people's productivity outside of the home, outside of the homestead, outside of agrarian circles, and their ability or inability or willingness or unwillingness to cook.
Well, that's complicated. That's a whole other book right there. Which you should write. Well, the story of how we stopped cooking, I'll tell that briefly. It doesn't entirely address what you've posed, but it would take a very long time to entirely address what you've posed. The conventional story is that women went to work and then cooking stopped. And there is a certain kernel of truth to that, that we didn't have as much time. There was enormous pressure on the household. But it's a little more complicated and more interesting than that. The food industry had been trying to get into the American kitchen for more than 100 years. And they'd been trying without much success to sell us on various forms of processed food, because the more you process food, the more profitable it is. That is the business model. Of your food dollar, 90 cents of it goes to someone other than the farmer. And this is a very powerful reason to cook, because if you cook, which means you're buying raw ingredients, which means more of the money is going to the farmer. In the industrial food system, the person making the packages gets more of the food dollar than the farmer. After World War II, the industry really redoubled. I mean, World War II, we were talking about in the green room, is a real turning point in a lot of ways, because you have these technologies developed for warfare that are looking for domestic uses. Munitions became fertilizer, nerve gas became pesticides, and on the cooking side, field rations became processed food, basically. And so they'd figured out all these techniques for freeze-drying, freeze-dried coffee, ways to preserve things and simulate things, and they wanted to sell them to us. And they worked really hard, and they were resisted for a long time. When women went back to work, or went to work, and in the economy, and the feminist revolution came, there was a very uncomfortable tension in households all across America, a conversation about how to renegotiate the division of labor unfolded at kitchen tables all over the country. I was party to one of those conversations. It was really not fun. It was really, it was uncomfortable. And there was a lot at stake. There was childcare, there was laundry, there was cleaning, and there was cooking. And I may have left out something, but those were the big four. And the industry saw an opportunity, and they exploited it brilliantly. Products come along to resolve tensions, anxieties. Sometimes they're created, sometimes they're real. This one was real. And they came forward and said, stop arguing. We've got you covered. We'll do the cooking. And this was a really concerted marketing campaign by many food companies. And one of your hometown companies, Kentucky Fried Chicken, took out billboards across America, the big bucket of chicken, and 2 words, women's liberation. Very clever. And they basically define not cooking like formula as the progressive thing to do. And men and women alike were thrilled to have this conversation aborted. My argument, to the extent there is an argument in this book, this isn't really a polemical book. It is more of an adventure, I think, and a story of an education. But that we're not going to go back. No one's talking about going back. We're talking about continuing that conversation and finishing it, and getting men and women, with a few exceptions, back into the... I'm sorry.
That's quite all right.
Back into the kitchen, and critically children. I mean, we really have to get our kids who have been, I know they have soccer and they have school, and they're overscheduled and therefore relieved of household chores. But they need to be in the kitchen too, because one of the most important life skills that we can teach them for their health and for their happiness is how to cook. So, anyway, that's what that's how I see that story unfolding.
Thank you.
So, do we have time for one more, or should we? 2 more. Okay, 2 more. Everyone else can sit down.
Very exciting. So I'm interested in the dynamics of social change that you're talking about, and it strikes me that there's something of a crisis of self-agency, individual agency in American society. A lot of what you're talking about, cooking, enfranchising children to cook, relates to a sense of personal empowerment and agency. So I'm wondering how we can recover a sense of that in America, along the lines of what Mr. Berry has outlined in his books, with a kind of communitarian approach. How does the balance of a sense of individual agency, whether it's motivated by Christian views, an evolutionary form, transcendentalist vision, which you alluded to earlier, how do we balance this sense of recovering agency with a communitarian vision such that the community is also invested, the individual and the community, and we're not merely looking to power brokers to change things?
Well, they ask hard questions in Louisville.
Don't they?
Really complicated.
I'm not ever coming back, are you?
That's it. Well, look at the food movement in general, and I think you find some interesting answers. What is exciting about the food movement, and I really do think there is such a thing as a food movement, is that it is a communitarian movement, and it's also about individual agency. What draws people to it, and why it is so, there's so many young people drawn to it right now, is that it seems more within our power to do something about. And that as much as we need changes at the level of policy, both local and national, we don't have to wait for those. There are very concrete things we can do. When we recognize that eating is an agricultural act, for example, we can make choices. And those choices we've seen have ramifications. Things have happened because of those choices. We've built, very large new markets, about $7 billion in local agriculture, $36 billion in organic agriculture. These are not the creations of, government fiat by any means. So that's very empowering, I think, to people. It's much harder to see that kind of progress around climate change, for example, even though we need it, even more. So that sense that people are empowered when they engage with this issue is very reinforcing. At the same time, what's drawing people to the food issue is what food has done for people for all time, for humans, since we had that first fire, which is bring them together. Food is not a thing. Food is about relationships. When you cook, you eat a meal. When you eat a meal, you eat with other people. It's communion. And and people are finding that. You know, I go to the farmer's market, and I see people there who are not in the market for food. They're just going there because there's a vibe there, there's a mood, and they're seeing their friends, and it's become a new public square. And you know, food gives us that. It always has. And that's just something we forgot for a few decades that I think many people are recalling now. And that's kind of the excitement of it. So I think it's very powerful as a communitarian movement and as a movement of individual agency. And I don't mean to minimize the importance of addressing these issues politically, because there are many people who can't participate in the alternative food economy because it's often more expensive. But many people are because they feel more powerful and they feel more connected. And to get both those things is pretty exciting. Last question.
Yes.
Then you get to hear about Kosher the pig.
My question is a little less serious and a little more
Thank
personal.
God.
But first, thank you so much for all you've written and for coming here and talking. And the Botany of Desire was very memorable for me, so thank you.
Thank you.
In your books that I've read, you give a lot of praise to the cuisine of France and Italy. And I had the opportunity myself to spend the past 3 years living in these places, in these two countries. And I think this experience really changed my life. And the two things I saw in France and Italy were a very hyper-local food culture, in that each township sort of has their own recipes and varieties, what Wendell called a taste of place. And I also saw that the thing that you spoke about in your radio interview earlier today, the leisure, the desire to not be too busy, 2-hour lunches and things like that. So can you just talk a little bit about what draws you to these two countries so much, and if you see any of that in America?
Well, you know more about France and Italy than I do. I've visited, and I like French restaurants and Italian restaurants. But they do have a different attitude toward time and leisure, and they also have a very deeply rooted food culture, or several food cultures, more deeply rooted than ours, and therefore a little sturdier in the face of marketing, a little sturdier. But there's also the fact that the European labor movement had different priorities than the American labor movement, and that's very telling. They fought for time, and we fought for money. And that's, interesting. That's very reflective of our cultures, I think. And the reason they fought for time is because things like long leisurely meals and vacations and a shorter work week were really important to them. And, you can argue whether we made the right call or not, but we have built an economy where we work a lot more than people in any other industrialized economy. We have less vacation time, longer work week, less maternal and paternal leave. And we're paying the price of that, which is we're really busy and therefore outsourcing a lot of very important things. We've never been able to take 2 hours to have a meal in this country. We have, if you read 19th century accounts of American eating, it was, the Europeans couldn't believe how we would just stand and wolf food down. We wouldn't even sit down. We were in such a rush. So there is a culture conducive to food culture. And what is happening in this country, I hope, is that we are brick by brick building that. The interest in food, the improvement in American food, which is gone on parallel with all these problems we're talking about. But the fact is, food is much better than it was a few decades ago. There is beautiful food in the farmers market now, and in many restaurants, and people are developing a taste for it. And I think we are less tolerant of terrible food. And even in the dreaded airports, I've been flying around the country. There's you can get occasional good bite of food now in an airport. You have to be careful, So that's part of what the food movement is building a culture of food that is based more on pleasure, leisure, and an enjoyment, and less on this idea of food as mere fuel. That is a remembering of everything food can give us. So Kosher the pig. I had a pig named Kosher. My father gave it to me when I was 15 or 16. I don't know why, because we were living in a co-op in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And ever since I read Charlotte's Web and Emmett the pig or whatever it is, I did like pigs as a kid. And you know, as sometimes happens when you express a slight interest in something, people kind of go overboard and they give you all sorts of, I had pig figurines and, you know, pig books. People just started giving me pig stuff. And my dad had it in his head that wouldn't it be funny to bring home a pig one day. And it was in June, I guess, and he came home and he had a shoebox with a little Yorkshire sow in it that was, you know, I don't know, 6 pounds, 7 pounds. It had to be fed with a bottle. But it was 89th Street. And anyway, in those days, my family went to the beach in the summer. And we had a little house on the beach. It was really just kind of a glorified shack on Martha's Vineyard. And I brought the pig up there with me for the summer. And I pinned it in under the deck. The house was on stilts. It was really right near the water. And pinned it in and fed it. And it ate like a pig. I mean, it ate, you know, enormous amount of food. And it's smart, of course. Pigs are very smart. And my dad named it Kosher. He thought that would be funny. And whenever the pig woke up, was hungry in the middle of the night, which happened almost every night. It was like having a baby. I mean, every 3 hours, this pig had to be fed. And she would, I cannot think of her as a she, would butt against the pillars that supported the bedroom and, you know, rock the house until I came outside and emptied the pig chow. And then when I was out of pig chow, emptied the refrigerator of everything, condiments, leftovers, bacon, anything. Anyway, my fence building skills were not great. And one day, I went down to check on the pig, and the pig had gotten out through the sand underneath the chicken wire and was making its way up the beach. And there's lots of little houses, you know, like a little necklace of houses on this beach. And I'm looking for the pig. And this had happened before. She had escaped, and I had to go get her. And now she's about this big, I guess, when this happens. And she had gone out because she smelled barbecue. A neighbor was grilling a steak and enjoying the, you know, the dying light at the beach. We had beautiful sunsets there, and he had his gin and tonic, and he had his steak. And this pig scrambles up the steps of his deck and, like a commando, topples his grill and takes his steak. And I got there a few minutes later, and the man was just rolling with laughter. Thank God. And I offered to go drive to town and get him a new steak, and he said, no, this is worth it for just the story alone. So I described this as the pig's revenge on barbecue. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks so much.